Thank you for coming out on such a dark and dreary afternoon. We're very pleased to have you here this afternoon. My name is Patrice Franco, and as the director of the Goldfarb Center and a member of the economics department, this is a co-sponsored talk. I very much welcome you to this important debate on universal basic income. As part of our Goldfarb Freedom of Expression 2019-2020 theme reflecting on inequality, UBI, Universal Basic Income, has been suggested as a part of a policy package. Will it work? I can't wait to hear the views of our speakers. Professor Lester will be introducing our visitors, but before he does, I want to thank him for his incredible hard work and tenacity in putting this debate together. Debates are hard to pull off because we need two smart, willing participants in this conversation who can arrive on the same day in Waterville, Maine. So it is quite a logistical challenge, and I know our visitors here worked with Rob to make this happen. The Cotter debates were funded to honor the legacy of President Cotter, who loved more than anything to engage in strong, evidence-based argument. I'm sure we're going to have that this afternoon. Professor Lester's excitement to bring this conversation to Colby carried us through the logistics. Many of you know him. How many? Raise your hands if you're, yeah, you've got a fan club out there, Rob. But for those who don't, Professor Lester came here in 2015 from Notre Dame. I am proud to be a fellow Domer as a hire in macroeconomics. He's a prolific publisher. Rob, I went on your CV. Wow, I'll just give you three. Raising Rates to Raise Inflation, Neo-Fisherian in a New Keynesian Model, The Opportunity Cost of Employment and Search Intensity, the relationship between economic freedom and economic dynamism. Those are only three of the things you can talk to Professor Lester about at any time. And I welcome you to do that.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
Sounds like a record.
And Siri, even though my phone is off, is ghosting me here. Wow, be quiet, be quiet. In addition to this rich research agenda, he teaches principles in theory, math, econ, economic growth, technology, education, and labor markets. As a colleague, he is very generous with his time. And I know from passing his office that he offers the same to his students. So thank you, Rob, for all your hard work on this event and all you bring to economics at Colby. So now it's all yours. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Franco, and thank you, audience members, for coming this afternoon. That was an unexpected treat. That's very nice, and in the spirit of reciprocity, most everything I've learned as far as staging something like this comes from senior faculty, in particular Professor Franco, so thank you. So, on to today's topic. What if every American adult received $1,000 per month? Not for having a particular socioeconomic or employment status, but by virtue of being an American citizen. The amount would arguably be enough to live on, albeit on a tight budget, and would not diminish with income. In other words, the transfer would cover basic living expenses and be universal, hence the name, Universal Basic Income. The merits and feasibility of this ambitious policy is what we are here to discuss this afternoon. And to do that, we have two distinguished panelists. To my near right, Amy Castro Baker. Amy is an assistant professor in the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to her time at Penn, Amy had spent more than a decade working with nonprofits and community-based agencies in Philadelphia and New York. Her published academic work ranges from social work to housing and public health. Most relevant to this discussion, Amy is co-principal investigator on the Stockton Income Empowerment Demonstration, where the city of Stockton is unconditionally giving $500 per month to 100 of its residents for 18 months. This is something we're likely to hear more about. And to my far right, Michael Strink. Michael is the John G. Searles Scholar and the Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Prior to joining AEI, Michael worked at the Census and Federal Reserve Bank of New York. His research is in labor economics, public economics, and social policy. Michael writes for academic and general audiences with publications ranging from peer-reviewed economics journals to being a regular contributor at Bloomberg Opinion. In his writing, Michael has discussed universal basic income as well as some of its alternatives. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our debaters. Okay, well, I'd like to start just soliciting both of your opinions, Michael and Amy, about why we are hearing such a groundswell of support, or at least debate for UBI now versus 10 years ago, where we'd be unlikely to have this debate. So,
you want me to go?
Yeah.
So I don't know, but I do think it's a good question. I think that a lot of the renewed interest in this is driven by the Great Recession, which is now 10 years old, but which had a unusually long and slow recovery that left a lot of Americans behind. It took really until the last 2 or 3 or 4 years for the recovery to reach most people. That, I think, created demand for thinking about the social safety net, thinking about public policy, and thinking about doing those things differently. That rethinking occurred on the political right and the political left. Some of the most convincing and interesting proponents of UBI are libertarians. One of the most interesting is a colleague of mine at AEI, Charles Murray, who wrote a book advocating for UBI, and nobody really paid attention, and then he re-released the book a few years ago, and there was much more demand for it at the time. And of course, people on the political left support this as well. So I think the interest is part of a just renewed interest in looking again at how we organize the safety net and how we use public policy to help make sure that nobody in American society falls too far.
Yeah, I mean, I concur. The first thing I'd say, if you hadn't said it was, first the recession. Obviously, thinking about who has recovered and under what circumstances. I think that has a lot to do with it. But just to provide some basic framing for the audience in case people are unfamiliar kind of with the concept, because it can kind of feel like this is something that Elon Musk dreamed up one day and it just kind of popped out of Silicon Valley, and suddenly Facebook people are talking about it, and Y Combinator's talking about it. And it's really an idea that has its roots in the ideas of democracy. So Thomas Paine first wrote about it. It was the subject of Dr. King's last book. And so just to share that to say, on the one hand, we want to ask this question, is this an idea whose time has come? And if so, why and how, right? That's like an important question to ask. While also acknowledging that sort of this idea holds a lot of history in American culture. It's really reckoning with this idea of what does it mean to have a just economy? What are the questions that we want to ask about how people get by? How are we caring for folks? And then the second piece I'd add is just thinking about the way that our safety net works, right? So if you think about how many people are, working more and making less, are not recovering from the recession. We have, I in particular study cohorts, so I look at the early baby boomer cohort, and they are entering retirement with a dramatic loss in wealth, by and large. So it's really prompting this conversation about who is the economy working for. And when we think about our safety net, we know it's not really working in the way that we intended it to. That's one piece of it. And then the second piece is just, I think people are tired. And I give younger folks a lot of credit for the resurgence in the conversation around guaranteed income and a just economy in general. Even 2 years ago, I'll say, when my research partner Stacia and I were writing, we were arguing back and forth about whether or not we could even talk about UBI, people would take us seriously as scientists on the tenure track. And even 2 years ago, we were saying, we can't say these words out loud. Fast forward, right, 2 years later, and we're running seed. So something has shifted in American culture.
Okay, so one of the things I think that came up in both of your responses was the inadequacies or the deficiencies of the current social safety net as it stands. And one of the things that you were discussing, Amy, is the question of justice. So just to guide us a little further, what does economic justice and maybe how that relates to inequality be that is a guiding theme this year for us? So what do you think of as economic justice? And Michael, I'd ask you the same thing.
Well, that's such a good question. I mean, I could give a real Rawlsian, philosophical answer. It's hard to say. I'll give my personal perspective versus, talking about it empirically. Is that I would say equal opportunity. And so when I look across American culture at who has been left out of accessing upward mobility, there's a long arc of path dependency in policy where people have been locked out of access to markets. So when I think about economic justice, I think about how do we remove the structural barriers that everybody has an equal chance of participating in the market, has an equal chance of sort of trying to build what we all want, which is to see the next generation do better than ourselves. And the other thing I'd kind of add to that is to say, while the focus here is UBI, it took us, 250 years of economic policy to get to this place. So there's no one silver bullet that's going to get us out. So I think of it as a range of solutions, a range of issues.
I think the issue of justice is central to this debate. Justice meaning the proper ordering of things in our society and appropriate balance in social relationships. This is one of the reasons why I'm not enthusiastic about UBI. UBI, I think, moves us in the wrong direction for social policy. Social policy should expect some degree of reciprocity between the recipients of benefits and society that's giving the benefits. And social policy should have expectations that are conditioned upon those benefits. The U.S. social safety net took a step in that direction during the 1990s. President Clinton famously promised to end welfare as we know it. And the safety net was pushed in the direction of being much more pro-work. And the idea behind that is that if you're receiving a benefit from the government, that comes from social resources, that comes from other taxpayers, what are your obligations? Do you have an obligation to be a contributing member of society in some fashion? Now, of course, justice also requires to scale that contribution according to certain things. So, people with work-limiting disabilities, people with child care responsibilities, people who are elderly. Obviously, there are different expectations for those people than there are for people who are in their prime working years who don't have dependent children. And who don't have any sort of work-limiting disability. So the question is, what do we expect from those people? If they're getting a check every month from the government, does society have the right to set expectations for their participation in society? I think the answer is yes. If the answer to that question is yes, then a UBI is no longer a feasible option, because the entire basis of a UBI is that the answer to that question is no. So I think that really does kind of get to the heart of this issue.
Yeah, so just one thing I want to add to that is, I completely feel you on saying that there are things that we ought to do, right? There are things roles that we ought to play as citizens. But I would also flip it in the other direction and say, what is our obligation to each other? How do we think about the social contract? And is there a floor by which we believe that you, as a human being, have dignity, value, and worth, and we do not want you to fall beneath that floor? And so, from our perspective, those of us that are doing research in this space, we're really saying this is about not that what you do as a person with your money makes you worthy, it's the fact that you are a person that makes you worthy of some type of floor that you're not going to fall beneath. So rather than saying, if you do this, you behave in this way, we will extend these rights to you. We will extend, citizenship to you, or, participation in the American dream. It's saying instead, you are a human being, ergo, you are my neighbor. How ought we then to care for one another? And thinking about it in that way, more from a place really of flourishing and human capability than it is one of reciprocity. If I'm giving this to you, then you're giving this to me.
So, if I understand what I think is a disagreement here, is that there's a trade-off perhaps between accountability and autonomy, at least in some sense. Where Amy, I think that you'd agree that from what I just heard, that there's a floor, and everyone ought to hit at least the floor, and regardless of what they choose to spend their funds on, we should be provided a floor irrespective of that. And Michael, would you be, I guess, against the idea of a floor without these sort of conditions being met about what they spend money on?
As a general matter, I am against that. I think that gets you into some kind of specific details about policy design. Which we can get into if that's of interest to the audience. The mid-1990s cash welfare reforms, for example, did a whole bunch of things. They imposed work requirements in exchange for receiving cash welfare assistance. They put time limits on receipt. They did a bunch of things like that. But one of the things that they also did was they didn't require that every single recipient meet those conditions. They required that a certain fraction of recipients meet the conditions. So at least 50%, at least 70% of people in the state of Maine who are receiving cash welfare have to be engaged in a work activity, for example. So that benefit design I like, because that benefit design imposes this expectation on everybody, but takes into account the fact that not everybody is going to meet the expectation, and allows for there to be some flexibility in applying it. So I like that flexibility. I think we should have that flexibility. You could argue that my answer on the need for that flexibility suggests that I agree that there should be a floor. But the reason that I say that I don't is because I think the question that we're discussing here is what the general expectation should be. And I think the general expectation should be that if you are receiving resources from other people, that you have certain obligations. We all live in society together. I don't view this as some sort of a punishment. I don't view this as some sort of a reciprocity. I don't view it as a quid pro quo. I think instead the way to view it is that we all live in society together, and we all share some responsibility for each other. And having public policy say that there are a group of people for whom we don't have any expectations. We don't expect any contribution from these people. It's fine. You can just get your check, and if you want to, play video games all day, or go down to the track all day or whatever, that's okay because you have autonomy. This is an argument you hear a lot from the political right, from libertarians. I don't agree. I think when we're thinking about a vision of society, we should be thinking about the rights and duties of everybody. And if you can contribute, you should be contributing. That contribution can take many, many forms, and I don't think public policy should mandate the form of that contribution. That contribution can be taking care of dependent children, that contribution can be volunteering, that contribution can be going to school, that contribution can be engaging in job training, and that contribution can be paid employment in the labor market. But we should expect people to contribute, particularly if they're getting a check every month that's financed with other people's money.
Amy?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think there's a lot of overlap in the way that we think about what our contributions ought to be to one another. So thank you for framing that. I think it was really helpful. The other side of it that I would just like to highlight, so I'm a social scientist, I'm a data person. And when I look at our social safety net programs and what works and what doesn't work, I see a lot of wasteful spending, and it makes me crazy. I hate inefficiency, it makes me bonkers. And so a quick example would be, Kansas spent $45,000 drug testing welfare recipients under the assumption they must be, on drugs, right? To catch 11 people. To catch 11 people. Florida did the same thing, right?
I know about it.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? And so we start out with this assumption that the only thing keeping all of you Colby students from becoming drug addicts is $500 a month or $1,000 a month. That's ludicrous, right? But we layer kind of these assumptions about people and how they are going to behave with their money on top of the safety net. And when we look at the data about how people use conditional and unconditional cash, it just doesn't bear it out. I mean, some of that I could go down the rabbit hole with that forever, I promise you. I won't bore you with that. But one other piece I just want to add, I'm assuming there's not many folks here from the public health perspective, but if you are from the public health world, particularly when we're talking about, vices, like are people going to spend this money on vices? That's really like the underlying question every reporter wants to ask me if they don't just ask me directly. And if people who are in active addiction or people who are actively battling addiction of some type, to navigate the bureaucratic structures that are there in place for any type of safety net benefit, including if we were to scale up and scale out UBI or basic income, are so insurmountable to people who are facing active addiction. It sort of filters that out to begin with. That's just kind of sort of like one loss mitigation tier that I'd point to. But really thinking about what are we missing out on? That's the other piece that I just would want to throw out there, is to say when we are putting people in these bureaucratic silos that have all this means testing, right? How are we locking them out of opportunity and ourselves by extension?
So the vices question is a good one. I come at that from the simple observation that money is fungible, and if you give everybody $500, it's not like they're going to write, whiskey on the $20 bills that you get, and then take, you know what I'm saying? Obviously there's an economic question, which is, how much people are going to spend money on stuff, and in some sense it's a nonsensical question.
It depends on how good the whiskey is. I mean, come on, what kind of whiskey are we talking about? Because I have opinions on this, Michael. It's not just whiskey, it's like what type of whiskey.
What type of
I think that's a debate for this room.
Okay. If you're going to buy quality whiskey, I don't know that I have a problem with that.
I think that would be the attitude of public policy for sure. I think this does raise another interesting kind of deeper question about UBI. Let me first step back and say that what people mean by UBI varies a lot. People on the political right, what a lot of them want to do is, those who support UBI, they want to eliminate the existing social safety net. Right? So no more Social Security, no more Medicare, no more Medicaid, no more food stamps, no more unemployment insurance, no more disability insurance. They want to get rid of all of that, and they want to replace it with UBI. And they don't want to replace it with $500 a month. They want to replace it with $10,000 a year for every person in the household. I mean, obviously, proposals differ, but that's a common one. So if you're a family of 4, you've got two parents and 2 kids, you would get $40,000 a year, no strings attached. But then we wouldn't have food stamps and all that other stuff. One of the reasons why that has appealed to libertarians is that there's a sense in which it increases liberty. It certainly increases negative liberty, right? Liberty understood as freedom from constraints. In today's social safety net, you get food stamps. You have to spend that on food. You can't spend food stamps on a new car. This would change that. You can spend that money on whatever you want by increasing freedom without constraints. Libertarians think things will be better, and they will argue that people will make bad choices, but they will be their choices, and that is good. I think we need to focus on the kids. So one of the reasons why I like conditional transfers as opposed to cash transfers, one of the reasons I like giving low-income people food stamps that they have to spend on food rather than giving low-income people a check that they can spend on anything, is that it forces them to spend the money on food, and they have kids. It's one thing to say, it's their choices, and if they want to spend all the money on whiskey of whatever value, or whatever else, that's their choice. They're adults, and society shouldn't be paternalistic toward them because paternalism is bad. But what if they spend all the money on whiskey and their kids don't have any food to eat?
I'll just call my colleagues in child welfare. We have systems for this.
There wouldn't be child welfare anymore.
Going down the data rabbit hole just a little bit, Amy, because you're on the ground floor of this in the Stockton experiment. I think consumption data is one of the things y'all are collecting.
Yeah, it's been, people can see it. It's really
What's that been looking
Yeah.
like? I've read some summary statistics, but why don't you give us a kind of bird's eye view of what's
Yeah, so first, one thing I'd say is that the appeal with cash is that it's flexible, right? So with regards to something like food stamps, your needs, if you are working paycheck to paycheck or living paycheck to paycheck, are going to fluctuate, right? So especially here in a space like Maine, right? You get a flat tire, you're in trouble. There's no public transit. How are you going to get to work, right? So whether or not you need food 1 month, or help with housing 1 month, or help with childcare 1 month, or maybe adult diapers because you're caring for an aging parent, right? These things flex. And that's part of the logic behind saying, people's lives are dynamic and flexible. Cash is dynamic and flexible, right? And so one of the questions we have with SEED is to say, how do we see that dynamism or that flexibility? How's that playing out in the spending data? So one of the things that we're doing, at the request of the community, is we are releasing that data publicly in the aggregate form. So you can go to our website and see, just like on your credit card statement, pie charts of how people are spending the money, essentially, how people are spending the $500. So the biggest expense, not surprisingly, is food. So 40% of the spending that we see on the debit card goes to food. The next category after that is sales and merchandise, which is about 25%, I think, at this point. And interestingly, in that sales or merchandise category, are stores like Walmart and the Dollar Tree, which are 2 key places that people buy food in Stockton. So in all likelihood, the bulk of the money that's actually being used on the card right now is going towards food in those 2 categories. But I don't know if you want to say more about what people are spending or what we're seeing. The other thing I'd like to say is that when you look at the spending in SEED, for instance, we're also seeing people moving money off of the debit card. So the money is given every month on a reloadable debit card. They get $500 on the 15th of every month that refills. But what's really interesting is how people transfer money off of the card. So Stockton, California, which is where the experiment is taking place, was once the foreclosure capital of the country. It's the place where the riskiest brokers tested a lot of pretty fringe financial products during before the housing crisis. So people know well fraud, and they have no reason to trust a white lady from Penn with a debit card who says there's $500 on it a month. Like, there's no reason for them to trust me whatsoever. So what we're seeing there is that people's past experiences with market abuse is informing the way that they're interacting with guaranteed income. So if you've been a victim of fraud in the past, people are much more likely to take the money and move it off of the card into a local bank that they know and that they trust. That's one other thing that we're seeing. The last piece I'll say about this, and I'm sure this will come up again in Q&A as well, is people are so savvy, and so we have this concern with rationality, like, are people going to be rational with their money? And what we know from a lot of, behavioral economics is that people who are living at or below the poverty line tend to budget best because they know to the day, to the week, to the hour when their money's going to run out, and so they learn how to stretch it. And we're really seeing that in Stockton in the way that people are moving money around. A clear indicator would be, folks are telling us, I'm moving the money off of the card because I saw what happened in Canada, and that experiment was shut down quickly. So they're paying attention to what's happening in political discourse and saying, what's the most rational thing I can do? Where's the safest place I can put my money to protect it? And we're seeing that really borne out on the micro level, which is pretty exciting because we want to build it out from a policy perspective. So seeing how different cohorts and demographics make sense of it is important in terms of spending.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. So with the consumption data that we have, Michael, I go back to something you were discussing that this has the quantity demand of vices vary with income, essentially. And if that
It's a normal good.
yeah, okay, if it's a normal good, but the elasticity is small, right? So the quantity demand doesn't go up so much.
There's only so much whiskey you can drink in one day.
So
You underestimate my abilities.
well, from the more conservative angle here, would you take maybe the vices going up by just a little bit, not by much, as shown by the data, and in exchange, getting rid of some of the massive bureaucracy that Amy is talking about with all the 1,000 drug tests to catch one person using drugs?
Well, I mean, I would get rid of the drug tests, without the $500 probably. At least the way the state of Kansas seems to be doing it. Kansas gave us Superman and Dwight Eisenhower, and it's been a long time since then. And now they're giving us a lot of bad governance. There's our social safety net is actually reasonably efficient if you kind of look at it on the whole and include social insurance programs. There certainly are, examples of opportunities to tighten things up. I think if we could, harvest a bunch of money from, not doing frivolous things or not, trying to chase people off safety net benefits like Kansas tries to do, cracking down on what conservatives like to harp on, waste, fraud, and abuse, and we could generate a pool of money with that. What do you do with that? I can think of a lot of things I would want to do with that before I would want to put it into a UBI program. I think if you're increasing people's financial resources, you're going to increase some of the money they spend on vices, and if those vices are illegal, that just seems like something that the cost of doing business.
So one thing I want to move to next that's related to the Stockton experiment and the more micro experiments we see is when you talk about scaling this up. So obviously it's come up in the Democratic debates. If it's $1,000 per month for each adult, that totals something I think just shy of $3 trillion. So how are we paying for this? And then how are the micro estimates going to inform us about the more macro question that's happening on a national level?
So I'll talk about the micro first, and I'll pass the macro off to you if that's okay. One of the things that we're really, really focused on in Stockton is cost, right? So, you all, if you're policy people and you don't know cost-benefit analysis, please learn it immediately before you go into the field, because you need to know what the cost of something is. Right, and so the advocacy push for guaranteed income or basic income is saying, we have this threat of automation, right? We have all these people who are going to experience technological unenforcement. or excuse me, unemployment. What would happen if all those folks who are losing jobs because of automation were then to receive this UBI, right? And so there's this idea of like frictionless, like how do we get rid of friction, right? How do we get rid of all these costs and all this inefficiency? What we're learning in Stockton and some of the other experiments that we're working, alongside, across the country is to not just look at how much are we paying people, but how much does it cost to run the program. And what we're actually seeing is that human contact matters. The things that are working best in the Stockton experiment come from human contact. So we're talking about, again, communities that have experienced the worst that capitalism has to offer. And the introduction of guaranteed income, what that's doing is fostering a new sense of trust in institutions. So when we're thinking about cost, it's not just how much would it cost to actually give people the money, right? But how much would it cost to implement? And then were we to scale it out and scale it up, how much would that cost to have bureaucratic integration? What types of institutional cooperation would need to be in place? The example I use most frequently with my students is to say, if you think about fintech, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of products, right? So how many of you use Zelle or Venmo? Cash App? Okay. How many of you think that your grandparents use Venmo, Zelle, or Cash App? My grandma doesn't. She doesn't even have a bank account, okay? Right? My point being, when we think about it on the consumer side or the corporate side, there are hundreds of products, hundreds, right? But when we think about the safety net and policy, and we think about basic income, it's like you're in or you're out. We don't apply that same lens of innovation, right? So we just say there's one thing, there's SNAP, or there's guaranteed income, or there's Section 8, right? So part of what we're looking at in these micro experiments is to say, what if we were to put that same innovation lens on and to say, how does an older adult interact with guaranteed income versus a millennial, right? Versus a college student, versus somebody who has kids in the home, and really taking a really granular look and saying, what works for whom and under what circumstances, so that when we do scale it up and scale it out, we have a better sense of what cost we're actually looking at. Because right now we really don't know, to be honest.
Is that possible with the sample size?
With the sample size that we have, it depends on what you mean. What possible?
Well, I guess if you aggregate across member states, but your sample size is at...
We're at 125, so what we're looking at is mixed methods. So in our situation, we're a small N, right? But what we're doing is we're working across the larger projects so we can embed similar aims to get stronger power essentially. But yeah, we could look at how do people make sense of it, because there's only so much I can measure quantitatively. That's just reality. I can tell you what, but I can't tell you how, unless I'm taking a mixed methods approach. And so that's really what we're doing, is digging deep into implementation and seeing how do people actually physically move money through Stockton? How do people actually make sense in their minds of what they're doing with the $500?
So Mike, we'll go into the more macro estimate. So let's say, the next few months go by, Stockton completes the experiments. Amy, publishes something very nice in terms of showing the estimates of everything, consumption, labor, etc.
And we can't get at labor. I won't make that case.
But then when we turn to the macro side, what does that look like when it's going to cost $3 trillion about to provide this at the national level? Something like that even feasible? Or forget about the desirability for a second.
Well, I think it's no. There are a number of margins of feasibility, I think, and I don't think across any of them this would be feasible. $3 trillion a year. We typically talk about costs over a 10-year period, so let's call it $30 trillion. That's more money than the Medicare for All program would cost, for example. And that price tag has recently kind of scared Senator Warren into backing off her plan a little bit. Bernie Sanders is still supporting his. So this is part of the reason why the advocates for universal basic income on the political right want to do away with the entire existing social safety net. Is just in order to make it more feasible to get UBI. Because if you got rid of Social Security and Medicare and everything else, then you'd have a whole bunch of money you can spend on UBI instead. So I don't think it's remotely politically feasible. In terms of the economics of it, adding another $3 trillion onto existing government spending, I don't have the figures kind of precisely in my head, but that would probably increase the size of government by 60, 70%, something like that. That's a huge increase, and in order to finance that, you would have to to increase tax revenue by 160 or 170% of what it currently is, that would be problematic for all sorts of economic reasons.
Yeah, there's, just to kind of add on to that, there's a lot of debate about those numbers. If people are curious to learn more, I really encourage you to look at, Joanna Marin Rescue's work, the No Strings Attached policy brief, in particular in her paper, from NBER, and also take a look at Carl Wiederquist's work on this, where he talks about net effect in spending, which I think the reality is, as somebody who's immersed in this space, we don't know yet what it actually would cost, and it's not as simple as $1 for $1. But yeah, I mean, I would point to Dr. Marinescu and to Wiederquist if anybody's really curious as to the best minds that are thinking about the numbers.
But nobody thinks it wouldn't be very, very, very expensive.
Carl doesn't think it would be as expensive as we think. And he has an interesting way of looking at it, but I don't know it well enough to articulate to the audience, so I'll punt it off to him. He's the expert in that space. That's the whole thing that he does, so I don't want to murder his idea.
Well, no ideas will be murdered this afternoon. So if we go away from the desirability and the feasibility in terms of the economics, and maybe take the most optimistic estimates or whatever those may be, going back, Michael, to something you said, would this be politically possible? Is this something that we can have some bipartisanship on? Because certainly people left of center seem to be in favor, at least some of them, and people with a more libertarian angle seem to be in favor now and historically. So at least superficially, it looks like there's room for bipartisanship. But I don't know, what do y'all think?
Well, first I want to see what happens with the experiments, right? Is to figure out what are we advocating for. As a PI, what is experiments? I don't know yet if I come down on the basic income side, meaning it should be targeted to certain folks, or the UBI side. I really want to see more data before I kind of come out swinging for either. But as far as political feasibility goes, I'd have to say yes. Honestly, I have never seen a topic that hits the middle 60 quite in this way. When I have something that my libertarian scholars that I work with are in favor of, and my most progressive left-wing radical scholars are in favor of, that tells me that there's some type of an anchor to the idea that might pull us together at a point when we're all being pulled apart. So what that something is yet, I don't know, but I do think it's politically feasible. Now, what we're arguing for and when, we'll see. I think it's a little bit early to be actually trying to change policy in this direction, as we don't have the data yet. But I absolutely think it's politically feasible. I cannot think of another topic that is justice-oriented, that has a body of support on the right, on the left, and in the center. I literally can't think of one. Maybe the audience can think of one. So share one with me afterwards if you can think of one, but I can't.
Michael, less optimistic?
Yeah, I think it's not politically feasible. I mean, if you look at the presidential candidates in the Democratic Party, there's no shortage of ideas for increasing government spending. And the leading candidates have not embraced this. They have embraced free childcare for every American, Medicare for all, free college tuition for every American, the cancellation of student debt for people who currently have debts, paid family leave for all Americans. I mean, they've embraced a lot of spending programs. This is not one of them. There is a candidate, Andrew Yang, who is advocating for this, and he's, and that really hasn't really registered. So by revealing preference, it's not popular among Democratic presidential candidates right now. On the political right, you know, we just spent between $1 or $2 trillion over a 10-year period on tax cuts, and there was a strong push by a few Republicans in the Senate to include what is kind of like a basic income and increase in the child tax credit. This is, you know, the economics of this essentially are that you write a check to everybody in the country who has kids, who has dependent kids in their home. That was a tooth and nail, blood on the floor fight. It ended up getting through because Senator Rubio threatened to take the whole bill if it didn't. But that was extremely, extremely difficult. In a bill that again cost between $1 or $2 trillion, the Republicans in Congress couldn't come up with $60 billion to increase subsidies for low-income workers without children, even though that's something they've given rhetorical support to for years. So, you know, it is hard to get Republicans to want to just write checks, and I think you know, the idea that we would give everybody in the country $500 a month just because it's impossible to imagine Republicans voting for that.
So just two things I want to add to that.
Please, and then we're going to go audience questions.
So one, in terms of political feasibility, just for clarification on my prior comment, I don't think it's politically feasible in this moment, but 5 years from now, who knows? The second thing I'd say is that, as you rightly pointed out, you know, that the leading DNC candidates right now are not advocating for UBI at this point. What they are advocating for are policy proposals that have a large body of data behind them. And we do not have a large body of data behind guaranteed income yet. It's coming, but it's not there yet. So the fact that people are taking it seriously and having political conversation about it, I think is good, but the evidence needs to be there. It needs to kind of be caught up. The last thing I'll say about this is to say, as wild as it sounds to say, will Republicans ever vote for this? There was also a time where we thought, you know, women weren't going to have the right to vote. There was also a time where we thought slavery wasn't going to end. There was also a time when we didn't think we'd have vaccines, right? And so rather than thinking from a scarcity mindset, I'd rather think from one of possibility and to say, like, who's to say we can't, right? Like, who's to say that we cannot make an advance forward? And I have a lot of faith in my Republican friends and family members. Like, I have a lot of faith.
I have no faith in that.
But I do, because I think that they have experienced the economy in the same brutal way that those of us on the left have, and they feel that same too.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. And now I think there are going to be microphones coming around, so if you just raise your hand with a question and call me. So, back here.
If you guys would identify yourselves, please.
Hello, my name is Phil.
Hi, Phil.
Hello. So my question was, you know, you said that, you know, UBI could discourage labor because people will just get checks and then feel the need to work. But if there are conditional transfers where you have to work, that obviously encourages labor. But there are also some conditional transfers that I think discourage work. For example, so disability payments. So if someone is on disability, but then they like feel better for whatever reason, and they realize that they could actually go out and work, but then they think, why should I if I can just stay on disability? That's one. And the second one is unemployment benefits, where again, someone could just like pretend they're searching for work. I think that's a pretty common trope, but just not get work in order to continue receiving those payments. And I think also in addition to that, there's a problem with administrative expenses for those programs, because you have to, you know, determine who's eligible for them and who's not. and a lot of money gets spent on that. And wouldn't UBI be a better alternative to that when people are not discouraged from work because they will still be getting the UBI?
So that's an excellent question. I would clarify slightly your characterization of those two programs. Those programs don't allow you, right? So they're not neutral. If you're receiving unemployment insurance and you get a job, then you stop receiving unemployment insurance. You can't receive disability insurance and work, basically, because the point of the program is insurance against the disability that doesn't allow you to work. We have a program which is arguably the most important anti-poverty program we have in the United States, the most effective anti-poverty program we have, called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a federal earnings subsidy to low-income households that requires you to work. If you don't work, if you have no labor market earnings, then you don't get any money from this program. If you do work, then you do get money from this program. This program was significantly expanded as part of the welfare reforms in the 1990s, and it has successfully pulled in millions and millions of people into the workforce who otherwise wouldn't have been working. In addition, every year it lifts several million people, including 3 or 4 million children, out of poverty. That, to me, is the right kind of program. It makes sure that nobody falls too far. It has expectations for people's participation in their society, and the incentives are to work. The incentive is to get into the workforce. So we can do it. In other words, whether or not UBI would discourage workforce participation, I think, depends a lot on what you mean by UBI. Would a $500 a month UBI discourage workforce participation? Maybe. Among some people, it probably would. If it really is universal, in other words, if I got it, if all 3 of us got it, it's not going to affect our workforce participation. It might affect the workforce participation of secondary earners and households and not primary earners. Overall, out of a country with 320 million people, I don't know how big the effect would be. If we do what people on the right are advocating, which is to give everybody, every single person $10,000 a year, including children, I think that would have a massive effect on workforce participation. If my wife and I and our 2 kids could get 40 grand a year for just doing nothing, that's 40 grand's a lot. So it would depend on the specifics of the program.
Amy, what do you think?
Again, I'd point to Dr. Marinescu, who's a labor economist and has done a lot of really fantastic projections on this. The other thing I'd add is to say, to me, it's the wrong question. I mean, it's a great question, and I think some of it's the benefits cliff, which I won't go into right now, but most people who are living at or below the poverty line are stitching together 2 and 3 jobs. If they work less, that's a good outcome as far as I'm concerned. Because we know from public health that when people are working the way that they are currently working in the gig economy, we have poor health outcomes. They tend to perform not as well as parents and not as well in the labor force, right? And so it actually ends up being detrimental. We are the richest country in the world, we work the most, and we take the least amount of vacation, and we're the sickest, right? So if we give some type of a guaranteed income that causes people to take less gig economy shifts, that causes someone to drop that 3rd shift job, what we expect to see are better health outcomes, which are good for the economy and are good for human beings. So I don't, to kind of start with, but people aren't going to work. We just don't see that in the data. I mean, we're seeing in our pilot experiment in Stockton that people are dropping shift work, and what they're spending it on? They're spending it on their kids. We're seeing that pretty clearly.
Great. Other questions?
Hi, CJ Sound, senior econ
Hi,
major.
CJ.
Hi. So as a young kid, it's hard to imagine the not wanting universal basic income.
I want it.
Yeah, well, as an 18-year-old, what would one spend on, say $1,000 a month? It's hard to like think that they wouldn't be spending this type of money on vices, considering that their parents are also receiving income.
Are you a full ride student?
No,
So just curious, how much does it cost to go to Colby?
it costs considerable amount.
Okay, so what type of a dent would $1,000 a month put in your Colby tuition?
It would probably put a good dent in there.
Yeah, that would be my guess as to where the money would go.
Well, yes. But, all right.
Well, look,
So
I mean,
let's
can I defend you? Can I defend you? Money is fungible. He's already paying his Colby tuition. This would be $12,000 of extra money a year, and certainly he would spend some of it on vices. He looks like he likes having a good time. I don't know that he would spend all of it on vices, but at least some of it.
Okay, so let's say people who aren't as fortunate to go to college. Okay? Now, those kids who turn 18, what are they spending their money on? It's hard not to believe that they would go, and once they turn 21, they'll spend it on all of the, what my point was trying to say before we got in, is people, the young children, or young adults who are susceptible to pressure, peer pressure, and addiction, what are those concerns there in giving people income, where they may not have to pay for rent, food, and a dependent such as their own children?
I would love to see what young people would do with $1,000 a month beyond paying their Colby and Penn tuitions. Our tuition's disgusting, I'll just own it. Like, we charge our students too much. But if you think about the potential and you think about corporate responsibility, social enterprise, all the companies and innovations that we have right now about how do we get companies to divest from fossil fuels, all of those ideas are coming from your generation. And so when I look at the people who are locked out of an elite education, I have to wonder, what potential are we leaving off the table? What types of businesses would you create? What types of innovative products would you come up with? What types of nonprofits would you found? How would you reimagine what taking care of one another would look like, right? Now, would you get some good craft IPAs instead of drinking Natty Ice and Gansett? Then maybe, right? And that's okay, right? But the point being, think about it from a perspective of possibility. Students and young people have tremendous ideas. That's one side of it. The second piece I'd say is that for those who are really struggling and living at the margins, most of those students are caring for aging parents, they're caring for siblings, they're caring for people who are locked out of the market economy. And so one of the other things that we're really interested in is pooling behaviors, is to say, how is money moved around networks? And when I look at younger folks, I see people who are carrying tremendous burdens, I do. And so on the one hand, I'd love to see less student debt, we'd see more home ownership if we did. But there's a bigger, broader world of possibility that we can ask as to how it would go or move. But that's a great question, thank you.
Can I just quickly say that is an argument against UBI and by Biden? So UBI would go to those people. UBI would also go to me. I would love to have $12,000 a year of more money that I could spend on whatever I want. But I think that would be kind of not the best use of social resources. And the fact that there are people who are struggling suggests to me that we should focus our limited resources on helping those people. UBI would go to me, it would go to Bill Gates, it would go to everybody. Why spend money there?
Other questions?
Yeah, so I think my question is more
What's your
towards...
name?
I'm Rohit. I'm an econ and global studies double major. I'm a sophomore. I think it's more towards Dr. Baker. So looking at your study, after giving the $500 a month to the participants, have you seen almost a multiplier effect occur within Stockton in the sense where you're seeing the participants use that $500, even if it's not all of it, at least a part of it, towards local businesses and local vendors, which is actually helping the local economy? And do you see that as a possibility if it's scaled up, in the sense where even if you do provide $1,000 to every 18-year-old, it doesn't matter if they spend $200 on a vice, as long as $800 goes right back to the economy? And secondly, do you see an increase in, I guess, a lot of the money which you're giving going towards paying for like insulin or just stuff like that, which you can see has like very direct real world increases in productivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as the local market goes in Stockton, I don't think that we're big. A really exciting thing is a new experiment was just announced by the Jane Family Institute in New York. And I believe it's taking place in Brazil. I could have that wrong, but you can Google it. And what they're doing is a much larger UBI experiment where it's only going to be given in a local currency that can only be spent in a set city, which will get at some of these really interesting questions around inflation and around local economy that I think are really, really important. To your question on insulin, yeah, one of the big kind of pieces that we're seeing in Stockton right now is people paying for past medical debt and medical care that's been going by the wayside for a really, really long time. So one of the things that we're interested in is to see like if we are able to alleviate that burden, like that medical piece, are people then able to return to the workforce and under what circumstances, and what does their health and well-being look like in the long run? But I really point you to take a look at what Jane Family Institute is doing, because an experiment that's contained in that way in a local currency can get at some of those questions.
So, Michael, folks are spending money on local IPAs instead of big beer. Would you be more enthusiastic about it?
No.
I love how honest you are.
What other questions do we have?
Hi, I'm Benjamin. I'm curious, in Stockton, the money that's taken off the debit card, are you able to track it, or no?
No, we're not tracking it. So what we do is so it's a mixed methods project. So some of it's traditional data collection in terms of quantitative surveys that go out, and we're doing a number of different text-based data collection modalities. But yeah, we're actually not really interested too much in how they're spending, to be honest. We're releasing the data because people are curious about it. What we do is follow up with people in semi-structured interviews to find out how they're making sense of the market, and that's where a lot of that qualitative data comes from.
And so are you worried that some of that money is going towards vices, then you're not being informed of it, or is that not the worry?
I mean, it's possible, but I'm not really worried about it, to be honest with you. Like I said before, earlier in the conversation, what I know as a social worker is that when people are experiencing, and when we're talking about vices, I should say, if somebody spends on alcohol and cigarettes, they're going to buy those things anyways. Like, to me, I think that's less of an issue. The bigger issue is, are people going to spend on heroin, meth, things that lead to big public health crises. But what I know, because I'm running the experiment, is that the amount of behavioral steps it took just to enroll in the experiment automatically screens a lot of people who are experiencing severe and persistent addiction out. So for instance, our recruitment took place with, you had to have an address in a specific census tract. We mailed you a recruitment mailer, you had to take that mailer, you had to open your mail, you had to log into a website, you had to type in a bunch of information, fill out a survey, be randomized into treatment or control, come to an onboarding session with a social worker, be onboarded into the experiment by myself. Those number of steps right there kind of automatically screen out people who are experiencing persistent addiction. So then the second question would be, well, what if you give them the $500 and they weren't a heroin addict then, but they're a heroin addict now? Well, I guess it's possible, but I mean, that's like saying any of us, right? The only thing keeping me from heroin addiction is $500. That's just kind of patently silly, right? So it's sort of, we're not too worried about it, to be honest. And if that happens, it happens, I mean, what we can say is that on the debit card, I think it's 1.4%, 6% are spent on vice goods thus far. But yeah, it's possible they're pulling out in cash and doing other things with it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm Ben. So I have a quick question. Although no new money is being printed to fund the UBI program, do you see the redistribution of money having an effect on inflation?
In Stockton? I don't think we can get at that with what we're doing in Stockton. I point to the JFI experiment. I don't know if you have something you want to add to that.
It won't be with 125 people.
That's a good question. That's a good question to ask, though, because we're talking about scaling out.
I mean, look, if you are going to be significantly pushing up the demand for consumer goods, then presumably that will have an inflationary effect. I think there's a question about a permanent increase in the rate of inflation versus which is a new steady state inflationary level, and it would
Ben principles class, so go ahead and run the fast.
It's a test of how good you are as a professor.
I mean, as with the question about what it would do to employment, I think the answer, I think it depends a lot on how the program is designed and how generous it is. My guess is it wouldn't do that much.
We have a question down here.
Hello. Great. I just wanted to ask a question about non-citizens in the United States, because presumably if we're just giving universal basic income to citizens, are they expected to pick up the tab in terms of like the price level going up? And then also like this question of, with Andrew Yang, I think he's calling for, I believe it's sort of like a VAT tax. So the idea would be there'd be like an additional VAT tax, but you'd have that check and that payment. But what if you don't receive that payment, or people in our society who maybe are kind of like off the grid, so they still have to kind of like pay that presumably increased price level, but they don't have that check. So I guess that's my question, is like, how do we reach those people who might not qualify or are otherwise off the grid?
It's a really good question. Just whoever's in charge of the mics, there's someone up at the front who's been trying to raise their hand.
But we should answer his question.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that this poor guy keeps raising his hand. I mean, as far, it's really a question of take-up is what I'm hearing you ask, is like, how do we make sure it reaches everybody?
No, he's asking about eligibility. He's asking about illegal immigrants.
Well, what are you asking? Clarity is something that's better.
So for those who aren't eligible, what sort of happens? Is that ethical for them to sort of endure, the price level increase? If we grant that assumption.
So two questions that I'm hearing you saying, would non-citizens be eligible?
Well, so assuming most programs that we've seen do not, include eligibility for non-citizens, so my question is, like, do you have an issue with that? Would you include eligibility for everyone in the United States? And then, if not, how do we balance this idea where we have basically people paying different prices or something? Because there's an assumption we get in check.
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest with you, I can't take a position yet until we know what the data says. It's really a question of, are we talking about guaranteed income, basic income, or universal basic income? And as far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out as to, who this program is going to be designed for, if it is a policy proposal moving forward. For myself personally, I lean towards the side of inclusivity. That's the most I'll say about that. But it really comes down to how the program and the policy is designed in the long term. The other thing I should say, which I didn't say earlier and I should say for this audience, is that C, the project that we're running, is designed to work alongside the existing safety net. So we are not proposing an elimination of the safety net at this point in time. We have a number of waivers and different strategies put in place that you can read about. They're pretty public. Is that we're looking at how the guaranteed income functions alongside the existing safety net. Because we're not going to talk about dismantling things until we see what works and what doesn't work. So, our biggest concern is that we don't generate a new form of reproducible inequality, because that tends to be what happens with social safety net programs, is we come up with this brilliant policy idea, completely in isolation from communities, completely in isolation from the real world, and then we create a new form of inequality and we act surprised, right? So this is why we're really pushing and saying what works and for whom and under what circumstances before we start rolling out policy proposals. But that's a great question. Thanks for clarifying that. I missed it. I appreciate it, Michael.
Hi, my name is John. I'm a double major in economics and government, and I have a question for you, Dr. Baker. Basically, you said, in designing your experiment, for lack of a better description, you basically had a lengthy process to someone weed out people who are addicts, people who might not be able to pursue a career, etc. Do you think by weeding those people out that it overstates the efficacy of your experiment, because you have people who are somewhat capable, somewhat competent, who are spending the money, when in reality, if you were to carry this out, you get people who are addicts, people who are somewhat incompetent, spending money on X, Y, and Z?
That's a great question. So, we're in RCT, so it's randomized. So, the only two groups that one, homeless, if you're experiencing active homelessness, you're not in our sample because you had to have an address in order to be recruited. Two, if you can look and see our demographics online, they're pretty public, but we have a lot of folks who are disabled, who are experiencing, various forms of market exclusion. So it's a pretty diverse sample, it's pretty representative.
But it's randomized, but it's not. Selection into the experiment isn't randomized. You randomize treatment and control.
Yes, correct, yes.
So there are questions about external validity in that context.
Yeah, but if you look at, it's a pretty balanced sample. If you look at it online, you can see, who is in, who's in the sample, what categories does that reflect.
I think we might have time for a couple more questions here. So I see a hand in the back.
Hi, my name is also Ben. I'm Hartley.
Hi, Ben.
My question actually starts with Alaska too, where we've seen
Alaska?
UBI
Yeah, the
play
dividend fund, yeah.
The dividend, right? So
Yeah.
that's been immensely popular, and it seems also touched on that by the Alaskan government. My question though is, as we move into this new kind of era where technology kind of reigns supreme too, and we've had profits emerge with Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, etc., and a huge gap emerge between the middle class and upper class in America. If we don't adopt UBI, what would be a mechanism to then kind of rein in the huge delta we have between tech firms like Apple, Google, etc., and the middle class? And if we do adopt UBI, how would potentially a VAT or a value-added tax play into funding UBI in the form of maybe taxing a small slither of each Amazon transaction and data that's also used by companies like Facebook that we should probably have some sort of profit from ourselves?
Who wants to jump in there?
You're just knocking over all the China.
That's actually an excellent
It's a good question.
I would take something with the premise of the question. If you look at the growth of income inequality, there was a lot of increase in the 1980s and 1990s. Over the last 10 years or so, inequality growth has slowed to a crawl or even decreased, depending on how you measure it. So that gap between the top and the middle has actually been closing, or at least not growing as quickly. I think what people care about, there's been a lot of talk about inequality in the last 10 years, and President Obama famously said it was the defining issue of our time. I think what people actually care about is how they're doing, not about inequality. If you look at the 1990s, inequality was soaring. Middle class wages were growing at a very healthy clip, and concern about inequality was dropping. If you look over the last 10 years, inequality has been flat. Concern about inequality has been going up. Middle class wages have not been growing as quickly as we would hope. So the kind of correlation between concern about inequality and the actual behavior of measuring inequality is much weaker than I think you would think. And that points, I think, to the policy response, which is, I think, to use government money to help people to command higher wages in the labor market, and to help make sure that no one who works full-time and heads a household is living in poverty. And we know how to do the latter better than we know how to do the former, but we have some good ideas about how to do both. And that, to me, I think is where a lot of the focus should be. One of the reasons I don't like UBI, one of the reasons why I don't like a lot of Senator Warren's policy platform is because it focuses a lot of attention on the upper middle class. The upper middle class is not where the problem is. The upper middle class is not where we should be focused. We should be trying to expand economic opportunity for low-income Americans, for working-class Americans, and help people to rise, not helping to make life more comfortable for people who are earning healthy six-figure incomes. Where does a value-added tax come into that? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We need more tax revenue. That's a natural place to look. But I view those issues as kind of disconnected.
So I might table the tax conversation for a second. Annually, discuss the ramifications on inequality
Yeah, I mean, we could slice and dice data all day in terms of inequality, but, we have over 15 years of data showing that the wealth gap is consistently growing. The idea that inequality is going away to me is, I look at the Survey of Consumer Finances, I don't see that. I look at the Federal Reserve, I don't see that. I look at, University of Michigan Health and Retirement Survey data, I don't see that. I look at Fed data, and I don't see that. So income is one thing, wealth is another. And that is really important because I totally agree with you. What we want to see is people rise. We want people to be able to be economically stable. And the gap that matters the most when we're talking about economic mobility and upward mobility comes down to the wealth gap, not to the income gap and the wages gap. And that's really, a place that we need to think, I would say. And the second piece I'd add is that I would agree with you in thinking about our data, and the fact that it's not taxed is staggering to me. It's just kind of sitting there. Like, we're all generating things on social media, and there's no reason that the American public should not be sharing in those profits, bottom line, from my perspective.
Any last comments before we close?
Great questions. Great questions.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks.
Again, thank you all. What a wonderful, vibrant, innovative debate, right? Civil, very different views. I hope you're able to take this out of this room to have these conversations of where we might go in terms of a more just society. I love the way that this opened up. We will be moving to dinner for those of you who signed up. I think we still have maybe 3 more spots at dinner. So that's a place where you can continue this conversation. And in terms of timing, we will be done for you to get to your 7 o'clock classes. Amy, I'm really nervous because I'm sure we do not have Scotch whiskey there. So we may need to think about the pub afterwards, something like that. I'm not sure since we talked so much about this. But thank you all for coming, and particularly to our participants here.